Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into Exploring Reality. Today, we are talking with Lydia McGrew and my friend Erik Manning from Testify about a stream that happened earlier um, on Trinity Radio's podcast regarding the minimal facts argument. And today, we'll be talking about that. So stay tuned. Welcome, guys. How are you doing?
Good. How's it going, Tim?
Living a dream. The tech issues before this have me a little frazzled, but I'm getting back into my zone here. So, well, for everybody that doesn't know you guys, Erik, you've been on the channel plenty of times at this point, so people know you. Lydia, you've been on the channel before, but on the off chance people that are listening now don't know who you are, would you mind introducing yourself really quick?
Sure. I'm Lydia McGrew. I am an analytic philosopher. I publish in theory of knowledge and in probability theory. And then in the last 5 years or so, I've published 3 books in New Testament studies as well, including the highly acclaimed 2021 book on the Gospel of John, The Eye of the Beholder, defending the reliability of the Gospels.
Awesome. All right. So we have a lot to talk about today, you guys. Erik or Lydia, do you kind of want to give a scoop of what's to come and what we're responding to and why we're doing this?
You go, Erik.
Yeah, I can give the scoop. And so I saw that Mike Licona and Gary Habermas were going to be on Trinity Radio defending the minimal facts. And it was set up as that we had minimal facts had come under some in-house, some Christian criticism as of late, and that they were going to address our concerns, the concerns over minimal facts, and to defend minimal facts, and that it still works. I thought that was an interesting title. But anyway, we'll maybe discuss that later. But yeah, so Braxton, who I love Braxton, had those two guys on and to discuss the minimal facts. And I was really hoping that there would be like some substance to the critiques and concerns that we had raised, particularly about the details of testimony being something that is not really something strong with minimal facts. It doesn't really give you that. But I also had some kind of predictions on how it might go based on previous ways that Licona has responded on capturing Christianity when people, in response to people critiquing minimal facts. And so I thought maybe it could be the same, but hopefully not. And I have to say, just kind of bluntly, and none of the criticism that we're saying here is meant to be belittling of anybody or any particular personalities, but I was just disappointed really with the substance of their response. It was like they hadn't really engaged in Lydia's criticisms or even just some of the popular level videos that I had put out. And even an hour into the stream, I had to bring up the whole issue in a comment, which I was thankful that Braxton brought up, about the details of testimony being something that we don't really have. And how can we know the disciples are rational if we don't know what the appearances were like? And well, yeah, I guess we'll see as we kind of go along. But so there was some comments about maximal data and why they don't think maximal data is the best approach. And that's what I definitely wanted to respond to as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Lydia, anything you wanted to add?
I mean, Erik has basically put it there. And so what we're going to be doing here today, among other things, is restating our concerns about minimal facts. And I find that there's a certain chance element. Sometimes if someone won't read a book, they'll read a blog post. Or if they won't read a blog post, they'll watch a stream. Or if they didn't happen to catch that stream, they'll watch this other stream. So you hope that if you keep stating something in different media, in different contexts, that someone who is interested in the thing will actually come upon it and think about it and engage in it. And I don't know who that's going to be, but I hope that it will prove valuable for some people to do it on this stream. I've also done it recently on Apologetics 315 on a podcast version too, and I'll be sending you that link. So we're just doing it, again, and also talking about some of the specifics of the stream that was on Trinity recently.
Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm really excited to do this. I'm really critical of the minimal facts argument myself, but I can't articulate it the way that you guys can. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm honored to have you guys on. So I'm going to pull up our clips here that we've decided to kind of use. And are you guys okay with me just kind of playing the clips, and we'll just take it as it goes?
Yeah, I've bookmarked them, and they're not exactly in like particular order. And of course, I would refer people to, if they're tempted to say that you're taking them out of context, go back, watch the whole stream, make your decision there. But yeah, I just kind of assembled as much as we could that we could respond to briefly on specific points that Lydia and I, after watching the stream, thought would be good talking points and kind of your.
Yeah, you know what? Before you play the clips, how about if I just restate our central concern, and then that'll provide some context for some of these clips, and hopefully then when we refer to it as we go through clips, it'll make more sense in a sense. So I'd like to kick off that way. So a central concern that we have is that in the minimal facts case, there's this statement, and it can be worded a little differently, but that that many scholars are agreed, large percentage of scholars across the spectrum are agreed that the disciples had experiences after Jesus died, which they interpreted as experiences of the risen Jesus, and it can be stated in many different ways. But the concern centrally is that this doesn't include either that those experiences were of a particular detailed nature, like that it seemed to them like they were able to touch him, or it seemed to them like they were all in a group having a meeting with him and having a meal with him and so forth. But it doesn't even include that they claimed that. In other words, as it turns out, a large majority of scholars do not grant even that the disciples claimed the experiences as given in the gospel accounts. Most, and especially when we deal with that across the scholarly spectrum issue, most on the more mainstream end would think that there is embellishment that has taken place there, and especially that those more physical-like details weren't even claimed by the original witnesses. They were embellishments that got added later. And then this creates a confusion concerning what is really granted, because it'll be claimed that, you can refute all of the alternatives to a true bodily resurrection just using what's granted by a large majority of scholars. But we would argue that's not really true, because this appearance minimal fact has had to be made so minimal that it's not really going to rule out particularly paranormal types of explanations or mere visions, because their experiences could be almost anything and be consistent with that fact as stated, which is not a good argument for the bodily resurrection. Indeed, I'll probably mention it again, but Bart Ehrman doesn't even acknowledge group appearances. He doesn't even admit group appearances. And so people get confused about how much is granted by scholars, and they think they've got more to run with there than they really do, because it's really more minimal than I think a lot of people realize. So I think that's a summary of one of our biggest concerns here. And then maybe when we run some clips, it'll show how that plays out in attempted responses.
Yeah. All right. Well, here's our first clip. I'll play it, and then just if you want me to pause it or stop it anywhere, just let me know.
We're not talking about Sunday school, surveys here. The Jesus Seminar reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. And yet in their book, What Did Jesus Do? They decided, the majority of Jesus Seminar guys decided that creed predates Paul's conversion. It was around before he set out for Damascus, is probably why he was ticked. Now, they do say, and it's a brilliant point, and if it's not the creed itself, it's the facts that are in the creed. I tell my PhD students doing a course on creeds, guys, at the end of the course, you might not believe I'm saying this, but it's not the creeds that interest me. It's the underlying data that interests me. And the New Testament word for this is homologia. It's a New Testament word, and it starts from the beginning. So here's what it looks like. Jesus dies. Jesus is believed to be raised, and these guys start talking about it right away. How soon? Well, Garrett Ludeman, the atheist New Testament scholar, just died about 2 years ago. Garrett Ludeman said they preached that message immediately, his term. And he's not the only one that says that. Preached it immediately. It's the gospel preaching. And of the creedal verses.
Let's stop there. Notice that phrase. They preached that message immediately. What message? Garrett Ludeman is quite explicit in his book that the physical details were added, embellished later. They were not what the disciples were originally claiming. His phrase is a seeing in the spirit. The original seeing was a seeing in the spirit. So whatever message they were preaching immediately, it was not that they had eaten with, according to Garrett Ludeman, mind you, it was not that they were eating with Jesus, that they all met together with him, they had lengthy conversations with him, and that kind of thing. So the use of that phrase, they were preaching that message immediately, and attributing that to Garrett Ludeman can definitely cause confusion.
Yep. Erik, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think we'll see kind of as we go along that this is kind of a continued theme. So,
right.
Yep.
In the New Testament, 80% of them are on the nature of the gospel. We know what their earliest message was. Okay, immediately, 80%. Probably that creed is in existence before Paul goes to Damascus. But even if not, the data are there and they knew it from the beginning and it's evidenced. And some of the best known atheists say, we got the material from the beginning. So it's the material that backs up the claim, not necessarily the creed. It goes all the way back to the cross according to these unbelieving New Testament scholars.
Okay, yeah, you can stop there.
Yep.
Okay, so the creed he's referring to there, I'm assuming the most popular one is the first few verses of 1 Corinthians 15. But that's a summary, and no shame for it to be a summary. I mean, that's fine, but you'll notice that it really doesn't tell you much in detail about what it means. You know, he was seen of this person saw him, and so forth. It's like a list. And that's not going to tell you what that was like. And it's not going to tell you whether that was a heavily physical-like experience. And I want to clarify something here. This was a question I was asked on Apologetics 3:15. Chad Gross said, so is your criticism that Garrett Ludeman doesn't acknowledge that they really saw Jesus? And I said, no, that's not my criticism. Of course, Garrett Ludeman doesn't acknowledge they really saw Jesus. That would be trivial. My criticism is that Garrett Ludeman doesn't even acknowledge that they claimed that they had lengthy conversations with Jesus, that they even claimed that they had meals with Jesus and so forth. He doesn't acknowledge they had experiences like that, and he doesn't acknowledge they even claimed they had experiences like that. So what he acknowledges is that they just had some kind of experience, and that's not going to get us very far at all.
Right. And I think that's the biggest beef that I have with the minimal facts is that it's a vague report. Anytime that you're looking into, like, if you're looking for a miracle to actually investigate, you don't want it to be something that's reported from far, far away or from long, long time after, or something that fits with the prejudices of the people. Those are all, if that's what you have, those are all unpromising candidates. But what you also don't want is a vague report of something or other. You know, if I talked to my neighbor and they said that, you know, I saw a ghost, and then our conversation was cut off, and they had to go, maybe their kid was being obnoxious or something, and they had to go deal with the situation. And that's all I had was they think they saw a ghost or something like that. And I didn't know the details of the report. Like, did the ghost tell them something that was tied down to reality whatsoever? Did other people see the ghost with you? What was the experience actually like? What were the details of that particular, your testimony? If it's just kind of that little vague thing, and then I never get to speak to them about that again, well, that doesn't, even if I think that person is genuinely kind of credible, I still don't have any idea if they're rational. what they actually saw. Maybe it was a rustling in the bushes and the hair on the back of their neck stood up. I don't know. And so without more details of testimony, where there's like a lot of different details that would substantiate such a claim, and that's what we have with 1 Corinthians 15. It's not a problem with the creed itself. I mean, it's just a creed. It's meant to express early, kind of what early Christians believed, but it's not detailed. We don't get the physical details of what they experienced. And so as a skeptic, if this is the best that you're offering me, I could see why the counter apologetics cottage industry, if you will, beats up on minimal facts so often, because you're not giving them anything really substantial to really look into. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And here's a way that confusion arises. I have a short quote here from April 6, 2018 post on the stream that was written by Dr. Habermas, and he gave the minimal facts, and the appearance one was, quote, his early followers had experiences a short time later that they thought were appearances of Jesus. But then as he goes on, he says, then was he seen afterwards having conversations with friends, just like any of us might do. Now, if you read the article, I'm afraid that the impression that you would get is that that's like a restatement of the appearance fact, or that that's something that's granted because, the heading was about surprising scholarly agreement and so forth. But there isn't scholarly agreement that Jesus was seen afterwards having conversations with friends, nor even that it seemed to his friends that he was having long conversations with them, nor even that his friends claimed that he was having conversations with them, just like any of us might do. And I think that's how that confusion arises, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have nothing else to add here. Anything else you guys want to add in before we get to the next clip?
I think I see what the next clip is, so I think that'll keep us going here.
Yep. All right.
Oh, my question.
I did want to get to this one. This is from a fellow Christian YouTuber whose channel is called Testify. And he says, my biggest issue with the minimal facts, my biggest issue is regarding the lack of details of testimony from the minimalist approach. It's not about appealing to consensus. I know they can argue for the facts on their own merits. In other words, and then he says, I'll just read this. Second, our biggest worry is the lack of the details of testimony from the minimal facts. We can't know the disciples are rational unless we know more about the appearances, what they were like.
I would say we explain all of that. And it's going to be a lot more when, Lord willing, my book comes out with 600 pages detailing a lot of these things. And they'll still say what they want. Anybody can say what they want. But we have plenty of stuff on the evidence. And you know what? Even atheist New Testament scholars regularly will say, Paul is an eyewitness. And these 7 books of Paul, which they all unanimously accept, Paul's given eyewitness data. Thank you. If you're going to give us eyewitness data, we'll use Paul. And we go on for data. So a person may not think we've unpacked enough stuff. I want to know what enough is. And I want to know if their method is going to pack more. They're going to be open to the same kind of criticism. Don't give me general sweeps of your position. And the larger the view is, the more sweeping you got to do. Take the big picture. Try to give as many facts for your view as you want for ours. As I said, this new one, I've got over 100 evidences plus additional considerations. Over 100 for just 6 + 1 facts, 7 facts. Over 100. And if someone says, I need more. Well, I'd say concentrate on your own theory and you produce 100 for every 6 facts you have, and we can talk.
Okay.
So Testify says we can't.
Go ahead, Lydia.
Let's stop that there. Dr. Habermas appears not to understand the question. I'm just going to be very blunt there. He doesn't appear to understand the issue, because I've seen his, I'm assuming he's going to use his facts, like 6 facts. It was 6 in that stream article. I don't imagine there's going to be any radical shift in which facts are being used here. And under no construction here are they using as a fact the disciples, as a basic fact in the minimal facts, the disciples claimed that they were having these lengthy discussions and these detailed, and they were able to touch Jesus and so forth. That's never one of the minimal facts. And it's never something that one argues. I mean, if you're going to argue for that, use that. You're not doing minimal facts anymore. Mm-hmm. So to say, I have all these arguments for my 6 facts, it's like, well, if you don't have enough fact, I mean, if the facts themselves are not the facts that are needed then the fact that you have 100 plus pieces of evidence for each of them doesn't help you. He does not appear, as far as I can tell, he is completely unaware of the nature of the argument. Now, also, he says something like, well, don't just give us a broad sweep. Let's get some details. Well, I've done that. I've written 3 books. I'm pretty sure he's read the first one. I don't think he's read either of the other 2. I've given interview after interview on the issues of the minimal facts. I've written blog post after blog post on my issues with the minimal facts. And as far as I can tell, he's not familiar with any of them. So we're not just giving you broad sweep. I've been working on this for years, and I've been giving lots of detailed arguments for the idea that the Gospels are not embellished, that the Gospel resurrection accounts are not embellished. So we've got 2 failures to engage here. First of all, just saying he has lots and lots of arguments for the minimal facts without realizing that that's not going to help. And then second of all, kind of saying, hey, well, what about you guys? What are you guys giving us? And seeming to be unaware that more has been given. So that's the first comment I would want to make there.
Yeah. So when I first heard that response, it seemed to me like, and it sounds like you might be agreeing here with what my initial reaction was. It seems to me like once you start adding in these other 100 evidences, you're not really doing that minimal facts approach anymore. You're closer to a maximalist case than a minimalist case.
Well, I'm making a slightly different point here, which is that as far as I know, none of the facts in question, I mean, what you're saying can be a direction that people will sometimes go, but the fact that's supposed to be the thing we're supporting, right? Like his disciples had appearances that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. That fact isn't enough. And then if you go back that up to, hey, the Gospels say that they had these much richer experiences. Now you've given, and if that's like your argument for that minimal fact, then you've abandoned the supposed advantage of the minimal facts, which is of hanging on to only what's acknowledged by a large majority of scholars. So, either you can go with the thing that's minimally stated, and in which case, support it as you will. When it boils down to that minimal statement isn't going to do it for you. Or you can abandon the supposed advantage of the shortcut, scholarly agreement, and you can make an argument for it that is highly controversial among scholars. And if it's highly controversial, then what becomes of the practical advantage that we hear so much about in minimal facts? So kind of it can be your reaction or it can be my immediate reaction. And either way, this isn't really engaging with the issue.
Well, what I'm afraid of, and I guess we'll have to see when his book comes out, but what I'm thinking is probably happening here is he's saying that, well, I have these 6, like 100 arguments to support these 6 minimal facts. Okay. Well, that's just piling more and more and more evidence on what they believed. But we already know that what they believed is not enough. We need to know that they were rational to believe it.
Yep.
And so just because you can give all kinds of different evidences for the appearance fact, and you could just kind of run through all kinds of different ways, in order to do that. But the upper limit is, well, that they believed it. That's as far as you can go with that. And so piling, like Lydia's talked about this a lot, called the bottleneck problem, is just giving more and more evidence as well. We see in the Gospels, at least there's these motifs of bodily appearances. And well, Paul believed in bodily resurrection. And well, the early church fathers believed in bodily resurrection. And we know, according to the church fathers, they were taught by the apostles, because Polycarp was a student of John. And we know that from Irenaeus and all that other stuff. That's just telling us more and more data about they believed something. But we already know that they believed it. I mean, we already have, he can just pile that on as much as he wants, but the upper limit is that they believed. So what?
In fact, we're going to see that with what Dr. Licona says here as the clip continues. He goes right to that bottleneck issue.
Okay. You want me to play that now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome.
can't know the disciples are rational unless we know more about the appearances, what they like. And I agree, the minimal facts that are agreed upon by 90% or better of critical scholars. You wouldn't include that Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead. I think that just comes up slightly short of the 90%. Although I think the evidence is abundantly strong that they were claiming, they believed that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily from the dead. And I use that, but I wouldn't call it a minimal fact or necessarily historical bedrock. Like I said, it just comes up a little bit short of qualifying as that. But you say, well, we don't know enough. I think we can tell through the fact that they are proclaiming these things, that Jesus was raised that Jesus was raised from the dead. Paul is also claiming that Jesus was raised from the dead, and he was a non-believer. So we may not know a whole lot about the disciples in minimal facts, but you got Paul. It's not just them, it's also Paul. And I think Gary now is putting in the conversion of the skeptical brother of Jesus, James, which it meets the 90% or better, and it meets good evidence for it. The reason I didn't include it in my large book is because not many scholars talk about it. Maybe, I think I only counted at that time, and again, that was like 2008. I think there were 29 scholars that I found that commented on it. Maybe there's been more since then, but because there weren't too many, I didn't include it. But those who did, you got heterogeneous consensus, and it met the 90% or better. So
and unbelievers too.
Yeah.
Unbelieving scholars concede the point.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's stop there. So at first, Dr. Licona is just misspeaking a little. Don't want to be uncharitable. He says that it comes in just under 90% that Jesus was physically raised. That's not what he means. And he goes on, makes it clear, like in the next sentence, that what he means comes in just under 90% is that they were claiming and believed that Jesus was physically raised. So just under 90%, he's saying, of scholars concede that the disciples were claiming that Jesus was physically raised. Now, I want to say a little more about what Erik said about the bottleneck problem. This is squarely in my area of expertise, of epistemology, and it's something that I can tell Dr. Licona doesn't understand that I've made this criticism. I don't think either of them does. So suppose we're talking about the probability of B given A. So let's say, for example, probability of Jesus was physically raised, given A, disciples believed that Jesus was physically raised. One of the things we've said is that if you're just given A, disciples believed Jesus was physically raised, with no details of why they believed it, then probability of B given A isn't very high. Why? Well, because people believe a lot of stupid things. Okay? It's not by any means granted by scholars that they were reasonable. Later, I don't know if we have this clip, but later Dr. Habermas says something like, you want to tell them something and they say in an argument, what is that, just your word for it? All we have is your word for it. And this is a critique of maximal data, that you're going to be asking people to believe something and all we'll have is your word for it. Well, no, I give reasons. We don't just have my word for it. But anyway, we could turn that around and let's take the disciples were reasonable to believe that Jesus was physically raised. Now, if I were a clever skeptic, this is what I would do in a debate with someone doing the minimal facts. I'd say, so we just have your word for it, that they were reasonable to think that? Maybe they were just jumping to conclusions. So all we have is your word for it. And I don't think that's ever really occurred to them that the rationality of the disciples could be in question. Now, on the other hand, if they really did have experiences like you're literally all sitting around having a meal with your friend and you're all like, pass the fish over here, and you're all interacting with them at the same time, totally understandable that they believed he was physically raised. And the details of the gospel accounts, even if we just defend that that's what they claimed, now we understand why they were so confident. My husband, Tim, gave a really good illustration here that I want to get in here. He said, take UFO experiences. So you have people who report having seen UFOs. And suppose someone said, like Dr. Licona does there, it came in just under 90% of people who investigate UFOs agree that the people who report UFO experiences believe that they were aliens. Just under 90%. Well, even if it was 90%. Like it's so qualified, okay? That they concede that they believe that they're aliens. I mean, so what? That doesn't tell us why they believe that they're aliens or whether they are aliens. So that's a very weak case, and I don't think there's a real understanding of this bottleneck issue. And so you will see, as Erik mentioned, Dr. Licona has taken recently to bringing up more and more things that like more and more removes. The church fathers were studying under the apostles, and the church fathers believed in the bodily resurrection. So probably the apostles believed in the bodily resurrection. Yay, we've got more evidence for the bodily resurrection. No, you don't, because let's say we added a probability 1 that the apostles believed in the bodily resurrection. It doesn't get any higher than that. Probability 1, they believed in the bodily resurrection. Still, if we don't know why they believed it, we don't have a very strong case when there's a real failure here to grapple with that issue.
Yeah. And I think what they would probably say is they might go like the NT Wright route and say, well, there was this idea that the resurrection would only happen at the end of time. And so for this mutation to take place of one man being resurrected from the dead ahead of time, it must have just been some real powerful experience. And we just have to assume that it must have been a powerful enough experience for them to have flipped the switch. Well, that's kind of like saying my next door neighbor, Mary, who's a Seventh-day Adventist, going back to the ghost story. Well, let's just throw that in there. She's a Seventh-day Adventist. She's basically a Christian physicalist. They definitely don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. They don't even believe human beings are spirit beings. They just believe we're purely physical. And so if she told me that she briefly saw, this brief story of her seeing a ghost, and I never get the details of that, well, just adding that in there, it might make me go, well, that is kind of weird that somebody with this religious belief thought they saw a ghost. But I still don't know what their experience was with this ghost, or who else was involved, or what else happened, who else saw it, or what the details were. And so I'm going to be like, that doesn't make me automatically think she was rational just because she has a religious background. Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to have some hesitations there. And I can imagine that Bart Ehrman or anybody else would say, nah, I'm not going to grant that it must have been really strong. So once again, you're going beyond what they're going to grant. Another point is, I think it's easy to overemphasize that point of N.T. Wright's. And I would like to give him the benefit of the doubt that he would not overemphasize it. We find right in the Gospels that the people popularly thought Jesus might be John the Baptist risen from the dead. So there apparently, and I think we can be pretty confident that the people in the popular mind there did not have strong evidence that John the Baptist had risen from the dead. I think we can all grant that. But guess what? They were Jews. So apparently it isn't true that Jews would completely resist all notion of an individual being raised from the dead anytime before the apocalyptic end times in the absence of tremendously strong evidence. That's an exaggerated use of N.T. Wright, which, as far as I know, I would like to think N.T. Wright himself would not go that far.
Anything else, guys?
I think we're good.
We could move on.
Awesome. Here's my favorite objection I get to our approach here, but here we go.
But let's just say it is. What is the purpose that you're sharing at that moment and defending the Christian faith and the resurrection of Jesus? Why are you doing it? If you know that you only have a limited amount of time, why would you go off on a maximal approach? If I'm involved in a public debate and I only have 20 minutes to give an opening statement, I don't have time for a maximal approach. And even if I wanted to give, let's say, an outline for a maximal approach, I'm not going to have time to really fill in all the blanks with it. I can only give an outline. I can barely go further than that in 20 minutes with a minimal facts approach.
Yeah.
So, why are you doing it? So I think that'd be the main question. And then another thing I would just add to that is, if you do a maximal or holistic approach, as you're calling it, and you add some things, let's say you add gospel reliability, you risk the chance that when you are engaged in a conversation with someone, that they will bring up something like, let's say, contradictions in the Gospels. And then you get off on a rabbit trail, which is really unnecessary. And talking about biblical inerrancy, divine inspiration, how to resolve these, are they reliable because the contradictions, was there one angel or were there two at the tomb? Potential errors such as the Quirinius being governor of Syria when Augustus did the census. Okay. So, what if Luke got it wrong? Well, that doesn't mean that Jesus did not rise from the dead. And so by doing more of the holistic approach, you do risk, with everything that you add to it, you risk the chance of just getting off on one of these rabbit trails. Whereas with the minimal facts approach, there are far, far fewer rabbit trails on which you can go.
Okay. So I really want to hit something hard before we try to even, defend the maximal data approach in response to that criticism that it takes too long. That is a distraction. We are making a philosophical, if I can put it this way, or a evidential objection to the strength of minimal facts. The claim is here, I'm assuming, that a minimal facts argument is a strong argument for Christianity, that a reasonable person who looks at that should, or at least for the resurrection, should be inclined to take the resurrection at least very seriously after he's heard the minimal facts argument. We're saying it has a weakness. It has a serious weakness that isn't being acknowledged because of this lack of detail and because of the fact that can't be made up for due to the bottleneck, while still sticking to what scholars acknowledge. To just go off, it's what the fallacy is called the red herring. To just say, hey, look over there, maximal data takes too long. My assertion would be, we don't have a choice. We need a different approach because there's a problem with this minimal facts approach. You have to engage with that. And it doesn't engage with that to say, well, sorry, your approach takes too long. I really want to hit that because it worries me that people seem to think that's a good response. I come along, I say, here's Lydia, there's a problem with the minimal facts approach. Response, well, we have to have the minimal facts approach because anything else would take too long. End of subject. And it's like, wait a minute, or they'll say it's really effective. What would we say if Bart Ehrman did that? If you pointed out an argumentative problem with one of his arguments, and then he said, well, I find it really practical to use this. It moves people in the direction of deconversion, and it wouldn't move them as much in the direction of deconversion if I tried to nuance it more. So sorry, never mind. We'd be playing that clip everywhere, right? We'd be going, look how intellectually dishonest Bart Ehrman is. All he cares about is, pragmatically moving people in the direction he wants them to go. So if somebody says this, I've even heard people say minimal facts, it works. I'm shocked when people do that. Now, Mike didn't say that right there, I just want to say. But he did say, it would take too long. It wouldn't be practical. It would be a problem. And I'm like, that doesn't respond to the issue. Eventually, we're either going to be ignoring this issue or we're going to be dealing with this issue. And if we deal with the issue, we're going to need a different method. So maybe we should get our thinking caps on and try to figure out how to do a different method that isn't subject to this actual argumentative flaw. And we should try to deal with those practical issues if they are practical issues. Maybe work with me here to try to deal with those practical issues, but don't distract from it by saying, well, your method takes too long. So that to me is the first and foremost thing I want to say. And Erik may want to add something to that, and then we can go on to try to address the, this criticism that it takes too long. And the short answer is no, it doesn't. But first we need to say, hey, that's not an answer to the problem we've been bringing up.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's if we know that this doesn't work, it's not going to get you to where you want to go. We're not going to just be like, well, let's just do this argument because it's easier and it's practically effective. That's kind of silly. And second of all, I mean, Than, you've seen this. I mean, I made a recent like short video where I basically outlined at least a maximal data case for the resurrection in a TikTok, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
So don't tell me that it takes too long. And the other irony is that Licona spent 7 hours, I believe, debating Bart Ehrman for the minimal facts recently, because there's a lot still, even with minimal facts, that you can unpack and talk about and discuss. And so we're saying that with the maximal data approach, there's a lot of different reasons that you can trust that the Gospels are written by people who are close up to the facts and scrupulous and are honest and know what they're talking about. And then the conditions in which they're making these reports, of course, we're more than prepared to back up these claims, just like you're going to get objections when you're talking to a skeptic with the minimal facts, and they're going to say, well, why couldn't it be this or why couldn't it be that? And what we're saying is that one could easily take the minimal facts and just go, okay, well, maybe not, and just be rationally agnostic about it. Whereas we're pushing people to where you can't have that rational agnosticism about it. You have to say that they're lying, and then you have to say that they're willing to die for a lie if our arguments go through, or you're just going to do your normal, skeptical, well, scholars, don't necessarily agree with that. Well, we're willing to push back and say, hey, well, guess what? Scholars are out to lunch in a lot of different ways. And I can give you like 15 different examples of bad habits that New Testament scholars have. Maybe we should just, instead of giving this particular industry, this status of
infallibility.
Of like,
a veto vote, so to speak.
Yeah. Instead of giving them this platform, maybe we could show problems with this discipline as a whole, that they've fallen into a lot of bad habits, and stop giving so much epistemic weight to their consensus.
And notice that Licona himself says there, well, in 20 minutes, he can only give about an outline of the minimal facts. And of course, that's correct. But at that point, I don't think he quite realizes he's just undercut his point. A 20-minute or 15-minute opening statement is just that. It's a 15 or a 20-minute opening statement. No matter what your method is, it's going to be an outline. That's why you have the rest of the debate, in which you go back and forth and so forth. And minimal facts can be scaled up or down, and maximal data can be scaled up or down. So on Apologetics 315, which I hope Van will link, I was asked to give an example of the 1 minute and the 15-minute versions. And so I did that for Chad Gross and for Brian Otten. There I gave 1 minute and I gave a 15-minute. And my only little cheat was that the beginning of the 15-minute, I said, so let's assume I've done the 1 minute. Now, just tack that onto the front, with the 15-minute, and continued. And then the Areopagus Forum invited me in April of this year to do a presentation, and I did a 35-minute presentation. So, I've got this 1 minute, 15-minute, 35-minute, and I'm not sure I'm up for a 7-hour right at the moment, but we could do that, if they wanted. Maybe we do it in sections or something. But the point is that it has these different levels, just like what the minimal facts has. And it's just that it takes a different form. It takes a form where you take this forward position at the beginning with the trilemma for the disciples. Either they were deceivers, they were mistaken, or what they were saying was true. And then because you're using what they claimed this, and that shows that it's not the kind of thing you could be mistaken about. Then when you do your 15-minute, your 35-minute, or your 7-hour version, then you go into talking about why do we think that they actually claimed this. So it's just a different format in a sense. It does not intrinsically take longer.
Yeah, and one thing I want to quickly add, because Licona brought up, well, what if the skeptic brings up contradictions or historical errors, and now you're off on some kind of big rabbit trail? Well, the skeptic doesn't get to dictate when and how you answer an alleged difficulty in a presentation. Just make a positive case. And when you're making a positive case, anytime we're dealing with testimony, we do expect some, possible contradictions or at least apparent discrepancies or different things like that. So that's not something that's really unusual when we're talking about eyewitness testimony. And just not answering a particular objection at a particular rhetorical moment isn't the same as conceding that, we're going to concede that for just the sake of argument. We could talk about that and we could say, hey, I have answers to those different things. Let me talk about my positive case. And then if you have questions about those, we could definitely get to those. And I know as like Lydia's husband, Tim, has a very heavily annotated version of Jesus Interrupted that he's got all kinds of notes on. And I believe Tim says like out of the 60 objections that Bart brings up as far as contradictions and stuff, most of them are based on overreadings and arguments from silence. And the interesting list of contradictions goes from like 60 to maybe 6. And that's not going to sink eyewitness testimony of the quality that we believe that we can argue for. And so, again, I just think that this is a red herring. And it's kind of like them bringing up contradictions is a red herring to begin with, but just saying that, oh, you're just going to get buried in all these contradictions.
It's like we're helpless.
Yeah, it's like, no. Like, first of all, bring it on. We can talk about those. Yeah. But let me put my positive case out there first. And I bet once you do that and you see the weight of that positive case, then the problem of contradictions is going to melt a little bit in that person's mind.
You'll notice that Bart Ehrman brings up alleged contradictions in his debates with almost anyone, be it Mike Licona, be it Craig Evans, no matter who it is. Somehow, the fact that they're not doing a maximalist case doesn't shut him up. It's an amazing thing. It's not like Bart Ehrman goes, oh, shoot, now I can't bring up contradictions because they're doing a minimal facts version. What do I do now? No, that's his dog and pony show. He loves them. He's going to bring them up no matter what. Another point I wanted to make is, did you notice that, and I've seen William Lane Craig do this too, Dr. Licona said, you're going to get off into a red herring of arguing about reliability, inerrancy, inspiration, and I'm going, those are not the same thing. Those are not the same thing, and we need to be really careful to say that by defending reliability, we are not necessarily defending inerrancy. I mean, inerrancy is what you might call the top level of reliability. It's 100% reliability. So if you're a traditional inerrantist, you definitely believe in reliability. But if you believe in high reliability, you aren't necessarily a traditional inerrantist. So we need to be careful, not to conflate those.
Yeah. A practical concern of this kind of objection to me as well. I've run into Christians all the time that are defenders of the minimal facts approach, who are not equipped to talk about contradictions. Yes. And it's almost, and again, this is probably a red herring, so I'm kind of being a hypocrite here, but it's created this monster of Christians who are not equipped to defend the general reliability of the scriptures. And all of a sudden now we're in this place where all we can do is say the scholars say X is enough to get us to the resurrection, but it's not. And so we need to go further.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because that came up when I was talking to Brian Otten, and I think this was recorded. I don't think this was on like the chat afterwards. He was saying something about, I don't have a lot of practice with this kind of maximalist approach because I was trained in the minimal facts things. Here are your bullets, so to speak. Here's your weapon, here are your bullets. This is what you do. And he says, so I haven't had training, and I forget who it was, which one of us, that made sort of the muscle training metaphor, that our muscles have gotten weak as far as defending reliability. And that's been a cost, practically speaking, of the use of the minimal facts approach. They'll say, we're setting that aside for the sake of the argument. Somehow we never get to it. We never actually get to it, and therefore people are unprepared. And the funny thing is, you will find Bart undermining people with those contradictions and those alleged allegations of unreliability. And I don't believe that an entire generation of apologists trained on nothing but minimal facts is really prepared to strengthen people's spine
Yep.
to oppose that. I also think that Erik did something really good here that you noticed a moment ago, talking about what Tim does with contradictions. We should talk about categories of contradictions. Not everything has to be, this one, this one, this one, this one, like they don't fall into any categories. And we need to get used to the notion of, okay, there's another contradiction based on a weak argument from silence. There's another contradiction based on overreading the text, etc. And then once you start seeing that they fall into these categories, it starts to look a lot less threatening. And I think that's something we need to do both in our debates and in our training of apologists.
Yep, I completely agree. Anything else, guys, before we move on?
We could do the next one.
Cool. All right. Here's the only your word thing, Lydia.
Yeah, I mentioned that.
And what Mike said about reliability, if someone asks me that, I'll gladly defend reliability. But where do I start in a 2-minute question? Do I say, well, some people want to defend Matthew, even as the author, even though it's not a majority? Well, I realize I said too much. I can't go into that one. Mike knows a fellow who did good research, that the majority of scholars in this study still conceded that Mark was the author of the second gospel, and a slight majority said that Peter was still his source. We haven't heard that that's a majority for a long time, or Luke Acts. Those are great moves. But, just to say it, if they're looking for a majority case, they're not going to let you say, oh, well, that's on your word, right? Where do you teach again? You both teach at Baptist schools, right? Yeah, that does it for me. You can't get there. Well, let me try John. No, don't go there. That's going to take you 2 hours by itself. Authorship. So I'm for reliability. Best case scenario, a course, teaching a course on it where you can develop it. And minimal facts would be one of the subways, one of the bedrock approaches to argue it.
Okay, so that's just your word. Okay, and so then I was suggesting that someone could say, oh, so why should we think that the disciples, must have had really strong experiences? Well, because they were Jews and they wouldn't have believed that it was, happening before the end of time without a really strong experience. Well, okay, you and NT Wright, who besides you believes that? That's not a majority. It's not a majority of scholars that would grant that they must have had really strong experiences. So that's just your word. Now, we're going to be talking about some tensions, and I want so sort of bear in mind there all these things we're hearing about it being too hard, taking too long, and being impractical to do a stronger case. And basically, I think we should agree that what they're saying is apologetics would come to a screeching halt if we didn't have the minimal facts, at least as far as dealing with people in a case where you don't have a lot of time. We would just be so stuck. So bear that in mind. And then when we move on to the tensions, I'm going to point out a tension with something that Gary says. But you guys might have something you want to add here about that's just your word quote.
Oh, I think we're good. Let's jump into the tension since we're already 55 minutes in. So yeah.
Your first question was asking me, what are some of these things that these guys allow? And it really is an exciting part of this that you can see what the critics allow. But by far, the most important reason for doing this is because each fact we use, from Mike's 3 to my 6+1 to our 4+1 we did together, we only use data which are multiply witnessed by the facts. So it's never a fact that critics say something's true, therefore it is. It's never a fact that evangelicals say something's true, so therefore it is. There might be a good reason to consider, especially if you know the guy, but you don't make that your starting point. Your starting point is the data on our side. And then you go, wow, well, then it's not surprising that the people's views are on the side because the data are first on the side. And I'll just say of the 6+1 that I just finished in volume 1, of the 6+1, if you count two things, how many separate arguments there are for each fact and how many additional of what I call suggestions. They're not separate arguments, but they're don't forget these two kind of things. There are over 100 considerations for those 6+1 facts, over 100 factual considerations. So yeah, we're happy that the critics allow this. But as I've told people 100 times, I get the question on talk shows, what happens if the critics stop admitting it? They're too close to the fire. They want to back off some of these. And I say, look, if they want to back off all of them, that's their privilege. The big thing is they've got to explain the data. And I don't think anybody can explain the data and not come away with a really strong view. So that's by far the strongest consideration. So the one that you might say the thing that critics are allowing is a nice ramification of the data as opposed to its own standalone reason. Also don't forget they do this. It's a nice thing to add.
Okay. Now, what impression are we getting from that? Hey, it's a nice thing to add. It's not its own standalone reason. Okay, if they were to cease to acknowledge it, what is he implying? We'd fall back in the data, right? I mean, is that the impression you guys got from what he said right there?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. That if the critics change their minds, like the consensus swung hard left or something, well, then we'd fall back on the data. So I see three major tensions. This is where I'm afraid I'm going to really be monologuing here, guys. I'm sorry. I see three major tensions with what Dr. Habermas says there. First is the practical thing that they've been saying and saying and saying. Even in this interview, we encounter it. Oh, what would we do if we couldn't use scholarly consensus? There'd be this big problem because using the data would take too long and we'd be in trouble and so on. And now he's like, no, it's just a nice thing to have. Well, which is it? Pick one, guys. You know, either it's just a nice thing to have or it's virtually a practical necessity. So pragmatically speaking, I see a huge tension right there. And you know, I'm saying that right now we're in this situation. Right now is the time. Don't wait for some hypothetical later time when the critics cease to acknowledge it. Right now is when we need to reconsider it. I'm having trouble even getting a hearing because everybody's like, la, 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 I'm not hearing you. I'm not listening because we need it. We need it. What would we do without it? You know, and they're clinging to the minimal facts for practical reasons. And then Dr. Habermas is saying, it's a nice thing to have. You know, yeah, if they didn't acknowledge it anymore, we would just go back to the data. And it's like, I don't see that. I don't see that at all. There's a huge tension there. Number two tension, much more important. The impression he gives there is that there's no epistemological force. He says it's not a separate standalone reason, that it's just a nice thing to have. It's just a convenience, you might say. It's a convenience. And I've had many people tell me it's just a convenience. It's just a convenience. No epistemological force. Now, I want to read a fairly lengthy quotation. I'm going to send Than this link. This is to a review essay that Dr. Habermas did of Michael Licona's Resurrection book. Not a little blurb, but a whole review essay that he wrote some years ago. So this is Habermas. Very early in his discussion of historiography, Licona addresses the absolutely vital matter of the scholar's horizons, the glasses that everyone wears when we view the world around us, and which can color severely and restrict our conclusions. And the more central the issues at hand, the more our prejudices and other views may rear their heads. Okay, when establishing a consensus of views, still Habermas, it is important to show that such a near unanimity is composed of scholars from all interested camps. It's important. We are not guessing about where researchers stand, and neither are we basing the case on a small sectarian element within the academic community. Rather, the scholars should hold a variety of religious and philosophical positions. Now he's going to quote Licona. So this is Habermas quoting Licona. Quote, these scholars span a very wide range of theological and philosophical convictions and include atheists, agnostics, Jews, and Christians. We therefore have the heterogeneity we desire in a consensus, and this gives us confidence that our horizons will not lead us completely astray. End of quote from Licona. Continued quote from Habermas. Licona makes an insightful comment here regarding guarding against our own horizons. We must beware of our own imported biases. When discussing the minimal facts, I have always purposely included notes at each juncture that list representative numbers of skeptics of various stripes who still affirm the data in question. This is a significant methodological procedure that serves more than one purpose. Among others, it assures the readers that they are not being asked to accept something that only conservatives believe or that is only recognized by those who believe in the veracity of the New Testament. After all, this sort of widespread recognition and approval is the very thing that our stated method requires. End quote. And you can find that whole article online. That's epistemological weight. He is not treating it as a sufficient condition for belief, but he is treating it as a necessary condition to be sure that we are not being led astray by our own biases. He's emphasizing we got our biases. We must be concerned about this. We must beware. So if you're believing something strongly against scholarship that only a small number of conservatives believe, presumably you should be worried that you're just falling to your own bias. So it's a necessary condition for inclusion in the minimal facts. And here Habermas says there's an epistemological reason for this. Now, he wrote that some years ago. Maybe he's changed his mind. I kind of think maybe he doesn't remember that he wrote this and doesn't realize that it's in severe tension with it's a nice thing to have. Okay, this is a much bigger kind of epistemic weight. Third tension, and then I'll shut up and go get a drink of water, which is concerning something else that Licona says a little bit later, and I don't know if we have a clip of it, but he talks about going in to see Dr. Habermas and when he was having doubts. And that Dr. Habermas didn't give him all of the 9,000 or whatever reasons for believing the minimal facts, but he gave him the minimal facts, and the question was, well, how do we know that? And he says, oh, hey, even these skeptical scholars believe it. And Dr. Licona said, so right then, I didn't need those other reasons. I was like, if the skeptics believe it, if so many skeptics believe it, there must be a good reason. Now, that's in tension even further, because if we're saying if this heterogeneous consensus believes it, there must be a good argument. And Licona seems to be approving of his reasoning at that time, encouraging it in other people. We should be saying to people, hey, I can only give this to you right now, but, take my word for it that this heterogeneous consensus believes it. And we want them to go away going, cool, phew, if that consensus believes it, there must be a good argument. He did a debate, or not a debate, an interview with Kurt Jarvis about a year ago, just a little over a year ago. He talked about heterogeneous consensus and historical bedrock. And he gave the analogy, if the Republicans and the Democrats agree that the COVID virus came from a lab in China, then it's probably true because those guys hardly agree about anything. Now, this is coming perilously close to exactly the thing that in the next breath he disavowed. We're not just saying that if it's a consensus, then we should believe it, but you just said if it's a heterogeneous consensus, it's probably true. So the access to the evidence, it's like, oh yeah, it's all about the evidence, but what's the access to the evidence? The access to the evidence is, hey, this heterogeneous consensus believes that the evidence is good. Then we're supposed to feel like, okay, then I don't even need to know in detail. It probably is good. That's in severe tension with Dr. Habermas's statement that it's, hey, it's just a nice thing to have. It's not a standalone reason. So those are three ways in which I see severe tensions here in the proponents of the minimal facts.
I can't add anything to that. That was phenomenal. Erik?
Oh, well, no, that's quite the takedown, really. But yeah, it's just odd because he was talking about like, well, I don't want to get stuck in the weeds of Methian authorship or Johannine authorship. And it's just like, But if you're okay with just saying these facts stand on their own, and I think there's good reasons for, first of all, authorship probably wouldn't even be the first place that I would necessarily go when making a maximal case anyways. But there's a lot of good evidence that stand on their own. And so just because the scholarship has swung far to the left on authorship with being skeptical of it, that definitely wasn't the consensus 100 years ago or 200, well, maybe 100 years ago, but 200 years ago, 300 years ago, or whatever. So it's kind of like, if it's all about the facts and them standing up on their own, well, then like, okay, great. So what? I mean, I'm prepared to argue for Matthean authorship or Joannine authorship, or even more importantly, their reliability as being people close up to the facts and know what they're talking about and are reporting because they're there. And so, yeah, it's just kind of, I just found that kind of weird that he brought that up. And it's just like, he's like, well, while I'm talking with the skeptic, I'm going to just bring up consensus all the time. Because he's like, oh, I should say this about Matthean authorship, but oh, wait, it's 60% or less than 60%. So, well, I guess I can't do that. And it's just like, well, if the facts stand on their own, then why are you acting like that's a constraint even to begin with?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, he seems to be assuming that a skeptic will be super impressed by the consensus. And, that hasn't been my experience. And I don't think that that's been really even Habermas's and Licona's experience. How many times has Mike debated Bart Ehrman?
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. There are people who have come to the Lord due to minimal facts. I'm not saying there haven't been any, but in general, particularly if they realize just how limited the consensus really is, and what we talked about before, which I think they could really hammer on even harder than they sometimes do. It's not like your debate opponent goes, oh, well, if this large variety of scholars grant it, then we're done here. I mean, for example, a point that I mentioned earlier, Bart Ehrman doesn't even acknowledge group appearances. He doesn't even grant that. And I forget what the current claim is, something about 80% of scholars granting group appearances. I would like to know a little more about where that's coming from. But suppose you said that to Bart, 80% of scholars, including skeptics, grant group appearances. What's Bart going to go? Woo, whoop-de-doo. He's not just going to crumple into a heap of tissue paper. So it's really not as useful even as they themselves bill it as being as some kind of like knockdown, well, 80% of scholars grant that or 90% of scholars grant that. Oh, well, in that case, the debate's over now. It's not as practical. And it also just, it's just not true that this is merely, to the devotees of minimal facts, a nice thing to have. If you're really devoted to it, you think it's a lot more than it's a nice thing to have. You think it's something you've really got to have for a variety of reasons. With which my water cup is empty. So I will be back in a moment and say something profound while I'm gone.
Lydia, when you're back, can you hear me?
No, she just got her headset off. So
totally fine. When she's back, do you guys want to take some questions after the next clip?
If you want to take some questions actually right now, that'd probably be some good, decent filler. Okay, and then cool. Or just like a question, and by the time
our
back,
friend, you know him, Noah Life, asked a question. So he asked, what precisely does the maximalist methodology? My gosh, I can't talk today. Maximalist methodology look like? How exactly do you approach and evaluate general reliability, criteria of authenticity, mundane and miraculous claims, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So no, it's a good question. Thanks, Noah. And so I don't even general reliability. I mean, even that phrase right there, like what exactly does that mean?
Yep.
And so that would be something that I would want to ask. And I would want to push past just general reliability. I would say that the Gospels have a very high reliability. And we need to argue for that. I mean, Josephus is considered to be generally reliable, but we don't necessarily take everything that Josephus says at his word. There's some things that he says that, I think we scratch our heads and go, I'm not so sure about that.
Yep.
And so what I'm looking for in evaluating that is evidences for eyewitness reportage. Okay. So when you have things like undesigned coincidences, for example, and I'm sure Noho is probably pretty familiar with those, so I don't like go in and unpacking something like that. I think those are very difficult to explain away on a just some sort of like literary way or just by accident that these things are happening. I think that those definitely point to these stories being rooted into eyewitness testimony or people who are close up to the facts.
Yep.
I'm looking at external confirmations. Do they know about the time and the place that they're in, and so are they able to give us details that we know that dovetail with actual verifiable history that are meaningful? I'm not talking about just something like who was the leader of the country, like they know about the Herods and stuff like that. Do they know the details of the history of the Herods? And we find that they do in a lot of different cases, like some of the different details of like what happened with John the Baptist and different things like that, and how they dovetail in these minor ways that just can't, again, be by accident or be by design, like through copying from those particular sources. And so it's a cumulative case. And when you have a lot of these different pieces of evidence that just kind of add up, that are way better explained on them actually being close up to the facts and reliable and truthful, versus them being, just all of these things kind of being there either by design or by chance, then that points to what we would argue for in terms of it being people who were in the know to know what they were talking about.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answers your question in a rambly way. You can always message me for more if you want.
Yep. You're in our group text. Nahoa. So other things, like if I'm gonna like put a Cliff Notes version of this or condensed version of this, it's like what would we expect to see under this hypothesis that the Gospels in the New Testament are reliable, right? So I just put out a video recently talking about the names that we see in the Gospels and the disambiguators that we see within them, and how that actually fits in really well with what we would expect to see if the people that wrote the Gospels were familiar with the time and place of the events that they're writing about. So there's tons of little data points that we can kind of point to internally, externally. We can, like Erik said, we can point to undesigned coincidences, both internally to the New Testament and externally with extra biblical accounts, to kind of just show there's different pieces of evidence that raise the probability of this New Testament or gospel reliability hypothesis. And that's like kind of the elevator pitch version of it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if Erik got to this to mention, but there's the casualness with which they do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's not, it's not so much like, here, let me parade out for you, these things and show off. Rather, it comes up in casual ways that are really seamlessly molded into the stories. And also, these are hard things to get right. That's why the Spider-Man claim doesn't work. It's not just some big thing like, hey, Jerusalem existed. There was such a guy as Herod the Great. These are little things. The way my husband Tim puts this is they get hard things right.
Yeah.
And in an era when it was hard to get hard things right.
Yeah. You don't want to fall into the Wikipedia fallacy, is assuming that they could just look these up at the local library or just jump on their phone and Google it or something. And so, and then it's also in the context, you get all these particular details and it's like, okay, well, why are they saying this in the particular context that they are, which would be in a context where they're willing to endure labors, dangers, sufferings in order to make these claims. And so, it's not like the passage by passage approach where we're just like, oh, is this fact, can we verify it because it fits these different criteria like embarrassment and dissimilarity and all that other stuff. And then, oh, okay, great. But now let's move to the next passage. And does that fit it? Oh, no, we got to put a question mark by there. It's when you see these things over and over and over again, you know what the gospel authors are like. And so you begin to trust them, the documents as a whole, versus putting a question mark over every little bit and trying to have to prove it. And maybe that helps a little bit there. So
it's an inference to the best explanation.
Yeah, exactly. Lydia, just before we get started on the next video clip, are you going to be able to take some questions at the end?
I don't know.
Okay.
Depends
We'll play it by ear.
Let's play it by ear. Let's see how long it takes us to get through the remaining. Actually, these are not my notes. They're thicker. These are my notes. They're thinner. So we're moving along here.
This is actually the last clip coming up. It's just a longer one.
Yeah. Good.
It's a long clip. So if you want me to pause it at any point, just let me know. But I think this is an important clip too. So.
All right. Again, starting with super chats, it's Caleb Jackson here. Says, how does the minimal facts argument address parallels to mass hysteria and apparition encounters that Allison brings up? How is the resurrection better attested? Thanks. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with this sort of thing. Mike, you and I were just talking about Allison the other day and somewhat in this regard. So what are your thoughts, gentlemen?
Let me jump in. Mike and I do this in our Case for the Resurrection book. So many people talk about this topic and don't make the necessary psychological clarifications. This includes some psychologists. Number one, you've got data, and you've got to do something with data. But sightings, the language of the resurrection is language of looking, appearance, sight. The language, New Testament guys say it's language of sight. But not all sight phenomena are the same as what we see in historical events. There are some people are mentally ill, and we call those psychoses. And we have a hard time believing things like, any crazy thing caused by medicine or caused by whatever, drugs. But a lot of other people view things, but they're not done by sight. We call magicians illusionists. And that second category is illusion. Mike, to his credit, was dialoguing by email, but he was dialoguing with two of the top psychologists in the world who've done a book on hallucination. And he pointed out to them that their case, they didn't say much of anything, if anything, for group hallucinations. But Mike pointed out to him, the example you used is not an example of group hallucination. It's an example of them seeing something outside of a barn or something. But they were seeing something outside of the barn. It was there. You can go back and see that every day. But it doesn't mean that's an hallucination. An hallucination is radical because when you believe something that for which there's no external referent. If there's an external referent and you're arguing about whether a big bird is a buzzard or an eagle, there is an answer to that. But it can't be illusion. It may not be a bird at all. And then other people have delusions and they see. So I think Dale Allison's a good friend of both of ours, but I think he doesn't make all those distinctions in this book. And I think he should be a little clearer about what separates some of those things instead of just lumping them together and saying, hey, maybe this is evidence of that. And I say it respectfully, but I think it's got to be clearer.
Regarding mass hysteria, my understanding, I'm not a mental health professional, but what I have heard from a mental health professional is that mass hysteria is typically auditory, not visual in nature. And as Gary just pointed out a moment ago, it was appearances. These are visual experiences that they had. So it seems to me that mass hysteria doesn't work there. In terms of the apparitions, the encounters with apparitions that Allison cites, I might be a little more optimistic about those heuristically in explaining the appearances than Gary is. I have a very good friend, Jonathan Kendall. He's a nephrologist, a physician, a kidney doctor. And I right now am reading a draft of a book that he has written based on some research he's been doing for the last few years on things such as apparitions. And there are, as Allison says in his book, and as Jonathan points out in his manuscript, there are more than of which I was aware, where the apparition can actually eat. The apparition can be touched, hugged. It's rare, but it does happen. And so it wouldn't make Jesus' appearances unique in that sense. Now, I would say this, apparitions appearing to groups are also rare. It does happen, but they are relatively rare.
And then you have to define what the apparitions are. By the way, Dale himself has a very strong sentence where he says, I'm pretty sure the empty tomb happened, and I'm sure that after his crucifixion, Jesus appeared to his disciples. That's a one-liner. In fact, last time I was with him, I said, that's my favorite sentence in your whole book. And he starts out his new book. People think he's such a skeptic, but he starts out his new book and he says, I want to be clear. I believe that Jesus appeared to his disciples. That's how he begins his book. Yeah. But some of the other things, the apparitions of group deal.
Yeah, we'll get Mike's further response concerning apparitions in a minute. But all right. There's a lot of misunderstanding concerning Dale Allison, and I think it's really important to take this opportunity to make clearer Dale Allison's position. It bothers me that what Dr. Habermas is apparently doing there is looking for a great sentence, a great quote, a great one-liner from Allison's book. When Allison says that the disciples saw Jesus, he is talking about what is generally spoken of as the vision theory, but it's an objective vision theory. It's not a hallucination theory. But he says they had vision-like experiences. He does not affirm, indeed, he is somewhat contemptuous of the idea that Jesus was present in a bodily, normal sense. He thinks they had what he calls vision-like experiences, and that many aspects of the gospel accounts, especially the ones in Luke where he invites them to touch him and asks for food, the doubting Thomas story, he thinks these are embellishments. They are made up. They are added. He does not believe that Jesus could have been photographed. So they're seeing Jesus. It's going to be far different from what we find in the accounts. And even though he thinks it had some kind of objective referent, it is not what has been traditionally meant by Orthodox Christians as seeing Jesus, okay, after his resurrection and in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And I'm disturbed by the way that Allison is being what I might almost call rehabilitated or something. And Dr. Licona has called him a fellow believer. And on social media, he has stated to people, oh, Dale Allison believes in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I would say, no, he does not. Now, he tentatively affirms the empty tomb. I was just rereading those sections of his book the other day, and he says it's hesitant, it's tentative, but yeah, he leans toward thinking the tomb was empty. But then again, he thinks that there may well be, for all we know, real instances where Buddhist gurus disappear and their places where they died are also empty. So this is not Jesus like appearing to his disciples where you could have gone up and knocked on his head, so to speak. And I think we really need to know that. So I want to really emphasize that before we go any further, because it worries me that there's this tendency, like we want to find somebody and go, oh wow, there's this really widely respected scholar who's trained in a mainstream way, and he says the disciples saw Jesus. Put that one on a banner and put it on your social media account. And we need to delve deeper into what Allison really means to know that. So then Mike's going to say a little bit more about apparitions, and we can respond to that at that point.
All right, here we go.
You still have to separate between illusion and delusion. And eating, you know what else Dale would tell you? Dale believes in near-death experience. He wrote a near-death chapter for my Festschrift, and he believes in near-death experiences, deathbed perceptions, post-death perceptions. If you believe in those things, that opens a whole nother objective category where you can see something that really occurred, but don't call it an hallucination if there's 5 people in the room.
In terms of the apparitions, I do think something that's major you have to take into consideration is the overall context in which they occur. So when an apparition occurs to another individual, they're usually, not always, but they're usually someone that they knew. Sometimes they're a stranger, someone who is said to it like a ghost of someone in the past. But Jesus, he claimed to be God's uniquely divine son. And he was also known as a miracle worker during his lifetime. We have sufficient evidence for that he was known as a miracle worker during his lifetime. Now, a skeptic may say, well, that doesn't mean he was a miracle. Well, I agree with that. But it does seem to suggest quite strongly that he was performing deeds that astonished crowds to the point that they regarded these things as divine miracles and exorcisms. So it's this person of Jesus. He's performing these astonishing deeds. He's claiming to be God's uniquely divine son. We have very good historical evidence that he predicts his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. And then when he's appearing to individuals, groups, friends, and foe alike, I think we have to regard these as more than just an apparition. If we're defining apparition as just simply the appearance of a spirit being like a ghost or something like that, I think we have to consider these more along the lines as an appearance of the risen Jesus to them. And it's also, I think it's germane that when a person sees an apparition, even if they're physical, you don't think that if you went back to their grave would be empty. And yet it said that Jesus, we've got some good reports and some decent evidence that there was an empty tomb. So if you're going to say, well, that's not enough, well, then what would it take to show you, what would it take to convince you that the appearance of Jesus differed from an apparition? So I do think that there's sufficient there to suggest the appearances of Jesus did differ, and it's especially the context in which they occurred. It's charged with religious significance.
Okay. So he's trying to respond to the notion that it was an apparition. And that's, again, in the context of Dale Allison. Notice that Habermas says, well, if you're going to allow near-death experience, that opens up a whole bunch of additional objective types of events. He says that like it's a good thing. Actually, that's problematic for the minimal facts. And I don't think they quite realize they're just kind of walking into that punch there. And Dale Allison refers to himself as being 4 different people. And I'm not going to try to go through all the 4. It was an interesting, very charming way he said it. But one of the 4 was to believe in all of these different kind of paranormal things. And of course, he has a whole chapter on rainbow bodies in his most recent book. When you open up all of these other categories, then there are a lot fewer limitations, and yet it isn't going to be a bodily resurrection of Jesus. So what Dale seems to incline towards, of course, he's profoundly ambivalent. He's the kind of person who goes on the one hand, but on the other hand. But what he seems to incline towards is something like the following. Jesus' body disappeared from the tomb, tentatively we can say, and entered a different sphere of existence. I think that's even the phrase he uses. So he deliberately conflates, and he's pretty explicit about this, the ascension and the resurrection. They happen at the same time. Then Jesus appears in far less detailed and far less physical ways to his disciples. In a sense, it really is Jesus. He really is there, but they don't have those same evidences that he's really physically there. And then they're convinced, that they've seen Jesus, but they have their own religious categories such that they interpret this in terms of a physical resurrection. But we have broader categories, and we understand that Tibetan gurus may sometimes disappear, and then their followers have visions or dreams in which they appear to them later. And so we realize that, hey, maybe the world's just a weird place. And this kind of thing happens to holy people with religious contexts surrounding them at times because they're holy. Strange old world, isn't it? And that's the kind of thing that Allison's leaning towards. Do I think that's reasonable? No, of course not. I did a whole couple series of videos on the rainbow bodies, and
those are really good too.
Thank you. I'm glad you like those. But you'll notice how I had to be a maximalist to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I really did. I had to be a maximalist about Acts, to talk about the context of persecution and the way in which it differs from the rainbow body context of persecution. And I had to be a maximalist about the Gospels in order to show how the claimed appearances of Jesus differ from the claimed, dream vision sequences or whatever that some of these gurus have had afterwards. So to say that Allison acknowledges a lot of other categories, yes, he does, and that's part of the problem. So when Dr. Licona says, well, if you see an apparition, you don't expect the tomb to be empty. Well, I guess that depends on what kind of an apparition it is, or what kind of a paranormal event it is. Once you're open to all these different kinds of paranormal things, then in a sense, you've got a greater library to pull from to bring up alternatives to a real orthodox bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ without using that then you're open to, unless somebody can push that maximal data case. Now, I'm not saying Licona's impressed with my work either. He's definitely, obviously not. But I think rationally, I can answer him more successfully than the minimalists can. And I fear that there's an odd, if you can't beat them, assimilate them kind of thing going on here. If you can't beat Allison, we'll just go abracadabra. You're an Orthodox Christian, boom, and dub him a fellow believer and a believer in the bodily resurrection, and that's not a very winning strategy either. So I don't think Licona really has a robust response to Allison there, though he is trying to give one.
Oddly enough, too, Licona spent an hour earlier, I think the week before, talking with Braxton about paranormal stuff, including some of his own stories, which I think it was Pine Creek Doug, or everybody's are no my favorite counter apologist, no, but who just kind of posted a clip of Licona's story, and he, was doing it in a mocking fashion, of course. But it's like it's odd to me that these guys, and maybe this, I don't want this to come across too harsh, but they'll be willing to defend these odd paranormal happenings and near-death experiences, which maybe there's some good evidence for near-death experiences. I don't know. And yet, when it comes to the Gospels and stuff like that, it's like, oh, we gotta limit our horizons here, and watch our biases. And it's just kind of puzzling to me, because it's like, guys, the Gospels are way more defensible, especially if you think you don't need necessarily. It was just nice to have, going back to that, the heterogeneous consensus of scholars, but yet you're going to get Pine Creeked because you're talking about, something spooky that you experienced when you were younger. Nothing against Mike. Maybe he did really experience something. I don't know. That's not for me to judge. But anyways, I just find there's just like a little bit of inconsistency, or I don't know there.
Yeah, there's a kind of a cognitive dissonance there. And I think maybe it's because the paranormal literature doesn't have this really strong, what should I call, academic culture that they're part of. So when you go out there and you get a New Testament degree, you want to make your way in New Testament scholarship. I'm going to guess the same for Old Testament scholarship, biblical scholarship. You want to have a place at the table in that scholarly camp. And it's established. It's been around for a couple hundred years. It's got its do's and don'ts. It's got its little moves and the way you're supposed to talk, the way you're not supposed to talk, and you're not going to be part of the club if you don't talk this way. And it's just a very strong academic culture. And so to defend that the Gospels are as strongly reliable as we're prepared to defend, it goes completely against that academic culture. It's not just that it goes against arguments, it goes against the whole feel of it. And you just don't talk that way if you're in the club. And I think paranormal literature, it's off on the margins anyway, right? So then it's kind of the Wild West. And so you don't have so much this feeling like I'm part of a sort of academic tradition, and therefore I have to limit myself in the ways that people in this academic tradition limit themselves. And so then they feel they're more, allowed to reach out and talk about these spooky things. I think that's really a big part of it. The other part is that I do see Dale Allison having an influence. I think he's an influential person, and he's a very charming person if he likes you. And so I think the time that Dr. Licona has been spending with Dr. Allison, they're bringing about a certain amount of influence. And the third thing I would say there is there's, I think, a misguided notion, and I'm going to step on some toes here, even of people who like my maximalist case. So you know who you are out there. I won't say the name of a friend of mine, someone I respect. He respects me, but he's gonna disagree with me here. But I think there's too much of an attempt to use the paranormal to refute naturalism.
Yep.
And so there's this notion, let's just pile on the spooky stuff, pile on the paranormal stuff to help us refute naturalism. Well, guys, naturalism's dead in the water. Every morning when I wake up and I go, I think, therefore I am. I just refuted naturalism. Boom, to 100%. I don't need the paranormal to refute naturalism.
Yeah.
But there's this notion that we just should grab kind of everything in the kitchen sink to refute naturalism as much as possible, if we think it's, legit and well evidenced. And I just don't have that priority at all. So I think those different factors are featuring into the far greater willingness within what we might call the club of evangelical scholarship to talk about near-death experiences, even, or the Shroud of Turin, or the paranormal, while at the same time, going avant, to arguing for the really robust reliability in the reportage, black and white thinking sense of the Gospels.
Eric, you got anything to add?
Well, I mean, just one thing. I mean, I think even Allison would kind of bristle at Gary's response when, he just kind of thought like, well, a lot of these things that people think they see, they're just these like vague appearances, behind the barn or something, I think is something that he said. And it's kind of like, I mean, this is just a direct quote from Allison. He says, our knowledge of what happened on the days of Good Friday is depressingly sparse over and against our knowledge of what happened at Zaytun. He's talking about the Marian apparitions in Egypt that happened, I believe, in the 60s. With respect to the latter, we have interviews from multiple eyewitnesses. We have photographs. We have on the spot, as it unfolded, journalistic reports from religious and irreligious. So there you go. You have your skeptics there, apparently. We have a statement from an investigative committee. We have none of this by contrast with respect to Jesus's resurrection, only a lamentable paucity of evidence and lack of detail at every turn. It's like, no, we don't. But this is Allison, right?
Right.
And so one wonders if we can't solve the puzzle of Zaytun, of which we know about so much, how we can solve the puzzle of Jesus's resurrection, about which we know so little. And it's like, this isn't the guy necessarily I think we want to be citing. I think he's going to say, when he's saying we have better evidence for Marian apparitions,
I think he thinks that, actually.
I
I
think he
didn't
does
get the
too.
impression there that Dr. Habermas was as familiar with Allison as Dr. Licona is, and as you and I are, because, Allison he's distinguishing, I think, between what is objectively there and what's merely a mistake about what's objectively there. And in some sense, I think he thinks Jesus was objectively there, but it's just not a robust physical sense. And that's exactly where we need to be going, beyond the minimal facts. So I think Dr. Habermas sounded a little dismissive, but you're right that Allison does like to flatten. I mean, he, in a sense, he loves David Hume. Someone was asking me to describe Dale Allison, and I said, well, imagine a combination of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and David Hume and Soren Kierkegaard. And that's Dale Allison. Okay. If you know Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes, was also very deeply into the paranormal and seances and that kind of thing. And so he's very Humean in the sense that he wants to flatten. He wants to say, if you acknowledge that if you think Jesus rose from the dead, then you should be way more open to all these other things. If you don't think these other things happened, then you shouldn't think Jesus rose from the dead. And so it's like all or nothing, all or nothing, all or nothing, over and over again in his book. And he gets positively indignant if you say, no, actually, I think the evidence is way better for Jesus' resurrection. Right. And here's why. Especially if you say that you think some of these people, and I'm not saying all of them, but some of them might be lying. I mean, that's going to really tick him off. It's, how dare you say they're like, well, people do lie. Okay. I mean, we Christians, we answer the question of whether the disciples were lying. We're prepared to answer that. We don't just get huffy about it. And we're not asking anybody to just be credulous and just accept every weird religious claim that comes down the pike. So, I'm definitely prepared to take that on. And this is what the old apologists called the argument by proxy, where you're basically like, hey, let's talk about this thing over here. Well, then, that's better than the argument for Jesus' resurrection. Dale Allison's all about the argument by proxy, unfortunately.
Yep. And I really like that language constantly that you guys use, which is hey, we can talk about that. I'm prepared to defend this. I'm prepared to argue for this, but let's talk about these things first and then move on from there. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is we have a generation of Christians right now that are not prepared to do those things. And that's why I think this maximalist approach not only is important because it actually works compared to the minimal facts argument, but also from that practical perspective, again, where we have, with this maximalist approach, we can also teach people to be prepared to answer those questions and argue from those forefronts. So,
well, I mean, and this is the last thing I'll say is, if the appearances of Zaytun were just this weird shining light on top of a church building that looked like a woman, and I mean, if 1 Corinthians 15 is completely compatible with a Jesus appearance being almost exactly like that, even if it was a group appearance. And so That's why I think that they struggle so much with these kind of objections, where we're talking about people who spent 3 years with Jesus and then spent 40 days eating and conversing and touching Jesus before he ascended. And they're not prepared to be able to defend that other than to say, well, we really think they believed it because of X, Y, and Z. And so I just think they struggle with this issue where maximal data is like, yeah, bring
it on.
Bring your spooky stories on.
Yeah,
we have criteria. We have all this stuff that we can talk about when we're ready to talk about.
Yep.
So, and that reminded me, you're saying that right there, Erik. Before we go to maybe one or two questions here, I haven't gotten a chance to say this yet. People are astonished when I tell them there are certain kinds of experiences the disciples could have had, even in groups, that would have actually been better explained by something other than Jesus being physically raised. In other words, the best explanation of some types of experience would be something that is decidedly not bodily resurrection. So, for example, suppose they're all in the room together and all of a sudden they see Jesus, but he's see-through and his feet don't touch the ground, and they all hear him say, "Peace be with you. I have ascended to the Father," and he disappears. Now, if that's the only kind of experience they have, and they know that's the only kind of experience they have, and they're like, okay, what happened to you? Yeah, I saw that too. And that's it. That's all they have. That's evidence that he didn't rise physically from the dead. That's literally evidence against the physical resurrection. And people don't get this. They're like, well, at least if we all agree they saw something, doesn't that help? Doesn't that get us part of the way? Not necessarily. It really depends on what the something is.
Yep.
All right, guys. Well, we got 2 questions if you want to take them.
Cool.
Awesome.
Yep.
So Joshua Tanis says, does it not seem that Licona to rebut Allison seems to fall back on max data?
I don't think so, because he's pretty careful about the way he states it. And what he does is he goes to what they call the second order facts. So you can have a minimalist approach, and even Mike and Gary they've got their minimal facts, and then they've got what they call their second order facts. And so the minimal facts, I think it's only 3. And then with the second order facts, there's 3 or 4 more, and they have to meet a consensus cutoff as well. It's just a lower consensus cutoff. So what Mike's doing there, like bringing in the empty tomb, or bringing in, what was the other thing? Oh, the alleged appearance to James, which, by the way, Allison rejects. I just looked this up. He at least rejects the idea that it made James convert. He's like, we have to be completely agnostic. We have no idea when, where, or how James had this. So he rejects that use of the appearance to James and just says, we really don't know anything about this. But anyway, those are what they call second order facts. So I think he goes to the second order facts for sure. But then when he goes to the context, like Jesus was known to be a miracle worker and that kind of thing, he states it pretty carefully, where it's just he was believed to be a miracle worker. So he's still sticking with his approach of being really, really tentative about this and not going beyond what scholars would acknowledge. But of course, as usual, that really undermines it, because it's like, okay, well, there are a lot of charlatans out there who are believed to be performing miracles. So while I agree with bringing up a religious context, that Jesus isn't just some random guy, I don't think it matters a whole lot to just say people believe that he performed miracles. In a sense, the most we could say is that kind of sets up the shot. Okay, like in volleyball, you set up the shot for somebody to spike it over. So in a sense, Jesus sets up the shot by making these claims, and then it seems that he rose from the dead. We have evidence that he rose from the dead. Then that is taking on that challenge that he set up in a sense for himself. So I don't know that Licona's really going to a max data. He's going to that, I think, next level up from minimal facts, which is still minimalist, is how I would put that.
Yeah, I think he'll add things like Jesus predicted his death and resurrection,
Right.
which, if anything, I think could work against him, because somebody could say, well, his disciples were simply, sure, I'll grant that, and that primed his disciples to have these kinds of experiences, at least the disciples, not Paul, obviously. So there's
Allison makes that argument, actually.
Yeah, he does. And then there's also, I think he'll argue, for like the Son of Man claims, and that's like a divinity, kind of thing, which, again, I mean, I think you can do that sort of defensively, but that gets us into a whole other discussion about taking more of the higher Christology claims, which are more controversial, which a maximalist can also do, like the claims in John and different things like that. And so, yeah, I think he still sticks within his what he thinks is defensible.
His frame. Well, and what he thinks is defensible as a historian.
As a historian.
And that is a phrase that I think we're going to hear more and more as the years go on. I can say this as a historian. I can say this as a Christian. Mike has several places where he does that in his big book. Historians can do this, and then there's this tacit, but if you got your historian hat on, you can't. And he's not the only one. In a debate with, I think it was Christopher Hitchens, Hitchens, of course, got real bullying and challenged William Lane Craig on the virgin birth. And Dr. Craig said, I believe that as a Christian. And so, that we only believe the virgin birth as a Christian. Craig Keener, in a conference that was recorded a few years ago, when asked about believing in other pericopes in the Gospels that maybe, scholars don't grant or something, he says, well, I go beyond the evidence. He said, I believe in those, but I go beyond the evidence. So I think we're going to see more and more of that, what's defensible as a historian versus what we believe as Christians. And I think that's highly unfortunate.
Yeah, and Keener even, he has this, he gets into almost like a religious epistemology, kind of like the Holy Spirit, it kind of seems
Holy
good
Spirit
to me, sort of
epistemology.
And it's just like, ooh, that's, I mean, that's just giving, again, the counter apologists just plenty of ammunition.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah.
And I like Keener in a lot of ways, but in some ways, I mean, there's other things I definitely disagree with, that Lydia outlines, especially in the Mirror and the Mask and the Gospel of John book. But that's rough. He
is very open to a number of fact changes in the Gospels. I'd say at this point, possibly he and Licona have sort of passed each other, going in opposite directions, and that Keener might endorse fewer of those than Dr. Licona does, but he definitely endorses a number of them. And the interesting thing was that in Christobiography, he said, I hope to make a contribution to the epistemology of historical Jesus studies. There's a sentence like that in Christobiography. And as of now, I haven't yet, that I know of, been able to convince Dr. Keener to read The Mirror or the Mask. He may have read it and just not told me, but back when I was asking him in email to read it, he said he didn't have time. So I wrote to him after I read that sentence, and I said, I'm an epistemologist, and you said you were hoping to make a contribution to the epistemology of historical Jesus scholarship. Don't you think it might be good if you would read my book? I thought that was a good opening, and he said, well, but I didn't mean secular epistemology. I wouldn't claim to make a contribution to secular epistemology. And I felt like that, and then he talked about Holy Spirit epistemology, like you were just mentioning. But I felt like that was a bit of a whiplash, because the sentence in Christobiography, it really sounds like it's talking about something that everyone can accept, a contribution to the epistemology of historical Jesus scholarship. And he doesn't talk about special Holy Spirit epistemology in the context. So I thought that was a little bit of a dodge there. And so I still hope that he will read The Mirror or the Mask if he has
cue the For the Bible Tells Me So apologia jingles there.
Oh, wow. We don't want to be like that. We want to encourage people to have a unified mind.
Yes.
So that they don't say, I believe this one over here is a Christian, I believe this one over here as a historian.
Yeah. That's Yep.
like you say, Eric, man up and defend the Gospels.
Well, I got.
All right, we got one more question.
Wonder where I got that from. It's hard to tell.
I know. All right, let's move on, and then we can call it a night. D asks, are there any live interactions between people on opposite sides who are aware of the issues? For instance, McGrew and Licona interact through video on literary devices, but not live. And I don't know of any live interactions.
Well, Lydia's debated Craig Evans on the Gospel of John, but I'll throw that one out there. Yeah, it's the only one so far.
Dr. Licona was asked several years ago by a number of people to, have some kind of forum, like Unbelievable invited him. Philosophy of Christie offered us space to do a pro and con symposium on the literary devices, and he refused. And he's refused a number of different places. It's not really a huge deal to me. It's not like I was out there, oh, please notice me. I'm just dying for you to take notice of me. But a number of people have wanted to see it and have brought it up, and he's consistently said no, that he doesn't wish to do that. And at this point, I feel like I wrote The Mirror or the Mask, and he did his 2020 he did a 2020 video series, and then I did a 2020 video series in response. That's about the closest. So if you want to watch both of those video series, go ahead and do that. But since then, I think I would take some persuading as well. Whereas, 3 or 4 years ago, I would have been like, okay, let's do that. But at this point, I think I have some reasons against it that I maybe didn't back at the beginning.
Fair enough. Eric, anything to add?
No, just thanks for having us, and I appreciate you letting us take a couple hours of your Sunday afternoon. And
it's my pleasure.
I would say I would just emphasize that this isn't about at all about attacking people. It's just ideas. And sometimes the pushback that I will get, and I've seen Lydia get it too, especially like online and social media and Facebook, is it's almost like there's like this kind of weird don't touch the Lord's anointed kind of mentality that people have when it comes to inner Christian debates. But I noticed that they don't have that same standard when they're an old earth creationist and they're talking about a young earth creationist, or they're an Arminian and they're bashing Calvinism. A lot of times you'll see some inconsistencies there. The reason why I'm interested in this is not because I think Mike Licona or Gary Habermas are like bad people or and I appreciate some of the contributions that they've made. The reason why I'm into this is because this is a very high stakes issue. What could be more high stakes than the resurrection of Jesus? And I have seen, because of being in YouTube for almost 2 years now, all of these people, atheists, on the atheist side, just being able to bash minimal facts. Maybe they don't do it as well as they could, but it's kind of easy for them to pick apart. And if they are seen as the leading experts on the resurrection, and that's fine. I'm not saying that I'm not picking again on them personally. If people want to hold them in that regard, they can do that. If they're seen as this is the standard, this is the argument for the resurrection here, and it's weak and it leads to a weak conclusion, that's a big, big problem. If their argument doesn't give us the details of testimony. And so that's why I'm passionate about this. It's not about people. It's just that this is a very high stakes issue. And even on the Christian side, I've seen this very tentativeness, Lydia alluded to earlier, where we've gotten weak. It's like we've skipped leg day, so to speak. I see a lot of apologists who cannot defend the Gospels in any robust kind of sense at all. And even, I think, have the question in their mind, can it even really be done? And I get questions all the time on, via social media, whether it's TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, where it's just like there's this tentativeness. And I think that minimal facts unknowingly has kind of created this, because we just give this such high credence to the consensus of scholars that they don't think that they can argue beyond that, because that's kind of what they thought the rules are. And if you go beyond the rules, you'll get the apologia people hitting you with the Bible tells me so jingle, because we've just created this goofy mentality.
Monster.
Yeah, and so that's why I'm passionate about it. It's nothing at all against Dr. Habermas. It's nothing at all against Dr. Licona. It's just, this is important.
Yep. And go ahead, Lydia.
No, I was just going to follow up on that and just say my take home of this for everybody is delve in.
Mm-hmm.
It's high stakes, so delve in. And so if you've previously done a minimal facts and you want to find out what the issues are, this is a 2-hour video. But if you prefer to read, we can give you things to read on it. You can take it from different media, but really delve in and try to understand. And if you've tried to understand these issues and you still have a question, it's like, I watched that video and I still don't quite get what the issue is or something, feel free to write to me or write to Erik and ask questions. And, all that we'll ask is that you will have previously familiarized yourself and, invested some of that time of your own to try to understand it. And then you have a further question.
Yep.
We'll be happy to answer it. But don't just skate along the surface and kind of go, oh, well, they said some things and they said some things and this is the side I like better, but really delve into it.
Yep. And I just want to echo your thoughts there, Erik, and kind of just add on my own perspective here too, because the ministry stuff work that I do here is, one side that people see publicly most of the time is this YouTube channel, my TikTok channel, social media stuff. But I also work in youth ministry. So where I live, I teach middle school and high schoolers, not only on systematic theology and stuff like that, but I also teach apologetics and preparing these kids to be able to defend the gospels, right? Like, how many kids go into college and learn that we don't have the original manuscripts of the Gospels, for instance, and all of a sudden become atheists? And so teaching them about all of this stuff is so important. And that's how we make a difference. We equip the body to be able to make a difference by being able to defend all these different things. And at least for me, that's something I feel really passionate about, is equipping.
Well, yeah, Van, you and I know we see it all the time, like on TikTok, you got these people deconstructing and they give their reasons and they're just terrible reasons, well, the canon was formed at Nicaea just out of random. It's like, and so definitely that. So again, thanks for having us. And I hope this was instructive for people.
Yeah, it was a blessing to have you guys on. Well, with that, then, everybody, thank you so much for watching. I will have links in the description afterwards once Lydia and Erik and I compile a few things. Please go check out Lydia's blog and YouTube channel, and please go check out Erik's YouTube channel. All the links will be in the description as well. So thank you again. God bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye.